Hi, everyone. Welcome to the RheumNow recap, the daily recap. In this case, the Monday evening recap of ACR21. I'm joined by the RheumNow faculty, and we're going to discuss the day's events that we thought were interesting. I'm joined today by Dr. Antoni Chan, who's from London, England, Eric Dein, who's in New Jersey, Olga Petryna in New York City, and Akhil Sood, who's in Houston. Okay, folks, the morning always begins with posters. You know, the cup of coffee, you got your breakfast burrito or your waffle, and you're looking for posters. Tell me a poster or an abstract that you saw this morning that you really liked. Eric, why don't you start?
Sure. So I'll start with one poster I saw. It was abstract 1367. It was from the World of Scleroderma, and this was by Dr. Anna Tucker. And they looked at patients with GI disease and scleroderma, in particular breaking down by different findings on esophageal manometry. And when they compared patients with absent contractility to other problems like ineffective motility or hypotensive lower esophageal sphincter, they find that these patients seem to be in a category of their own. So the patients with the absent contractility, they're the ones that are more likely to have diffuse cutaneous skin disease, cardiac disease, and all of the patients in the cohort that they looked at, so 14 patients that had passed away from complications from scleroderma, all mostly kind of cardiovascular and pulmonary, were part of this group of absent contractility. So 21% of that group had mortality compared to 0 in the other groups. So I think this is an interesting poster, just showing some things about GI scleroderma being something serious and a risk factor of something else going on as well.
So you said absent contractility? Is that esophageal contractility is absent?
Yeah, so particularly the patients that have completely absent contractility of the esophagus are different from the ones that just have ineffective motility. So the ones that they really find nothing when you do the manometry, they seem to be in a category of their own.
And this is a finding that we would commonly see because we not uncommonly will do upper GI studies, including manometry and barium swallows and whatnot. That might be a really nice, useful clinical tool. Akhil, tell me a poster you saw you liked.
Yeah, so for me, today really the theme seemed to be is aging. Started with a lecture on multi-complexity and management of rheumatoid arthritis, and it led me to seeing a lot of the posters that really stood out were on aging and comorbidities. And one that I want to highlight was abstract 1044 by members at UCSF. They looked at polypharmacy in elderly patients with rheumatic diseases, and they used the RISE registry. And using this large database, they were able to find that approximately 40% of patients across all rheumatic diseases were receiving inappropriate medications, including opioids, benzos, and NSAIDs and other medications as per the Beers criteria. And it didn't really differ by rheumatic disease type. And then one thing I thought was really interesting and was really, I thought, significant in the finding was that in the older patients receiving opioids, they're most likely to come from areas of low socioeconomic status or neighborhoods with low socioeconomic status, which I thought was really interesting and really alarming.
Yeah, this is the ugly side of medicine, and who's to blame? All of us. My rule and the way I try to combat polypharmacy is, if they've got more than 6 or 7 drugs and you want to add one, you got to take one away. And I tell the patient, when the doctor start piling the drugs onto you, say, Doc, I'll take your new medicine, but you got to take away 2. And don't be messing with Dr. Cush's, methotrexate. He yells at me when you do that. So, you have to have some strategy that you're going to contribute to the resolution of the problem. There's a major safety issue. Does anybody else have any recommendations on how to manage polypharmacy, which is, as Akhil points out, a really big problem?
I agree with actually trying to minimize the amount of medications patients take. And I think EMR is quite helpful in this regard, because a lot of times when we prescribe, we don't think about what patient is on. And then most of the EMRs now, when you prescribe a new medication, it gives you a list of potential interactions. So it makes you stop and think, oh, hold on a minute. Does this patient really needs to be on that or this drug? And can we adjust their treatment plan to make it more workable for the patient without overloading them with these multiple medications? So I think EMI is quite useful.
Eric, your suggestion?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a problem when you're giving medications to treat other medications. So if you're giving medications for constipation because they're on opiates, or you're treating dry eyes because they're on anticholinergics, that's when you need to flag something needs to be done there.
That's a really good one. I like that one because you can knock out two meds, prednisone, and you're given a bisphosphonate for glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. Now, maybe you can't drop both of them, but that's a really smart idea. Anthony, how do you handle this?
We usually would involve our pharmacists. Certainly, they have one very useful thing, which is the green pen. They come around on our ward rounds and they strike out things that shouldn't be there. So that is the most powerful thing I've found, the green pen.
The green pen, that sounds scary. I'm going to see if I got a green pen here. Anyway,
So
all right. Who else has got an interesting abstract from this morning? Anthony?
Yeah, so talking about methotrexate, 1444 was an interesting study that came from the UK, and it looked at the incidence of nausea and also alopecia in people who were taking methotrexate. And what they found was that there was a correlation with alcohol intake, female gender, disease activity, and also interestingly, the patient's concern about having nausea predicts nausea, so a nocebo effect. And if they were older, then they tended not to have so much nausea. With alopecia, they found also a very similar thing, and the HAC score also somewhat correlated with they had alopecia. So I think one of the things that we can modify is certainly the alcohol intake. So if you didn't drink, they seem to have less nausea on methotrexate. So I think that's a kind of practical study that shows some of the advice that we can be giving our patients who are on methotrexate.
I've never heard that. That's really kind of interesting. That might be a potential contributor, because what most rheumatologists do with nausea is they just up the folate dose, and that I don't think works. My recommendation for nausea is actually either dextromethorphan as Mucinex DM given with methotrexate and the day after, and there's a biology behind that. It's another lecture. Or if they have oral ulcers and nausea, then vitamin A every day, 8,000 units a day. And these work really, really well. And I've actually published those, did abstracts on those. So, but the idea of stopping something like alcohol, that would make sense. Alopecia, methotrexate, seems like mainly women complain of this, and I don't really have a solution for it other than stopping methotrexate. Does anybody else have a better way of dealing with this? No. Okay.
No.
Olga, tell us a good abstract.
Yeah, I really like the abstract 1083, which speaks about COVID-19 outcomes in patients with autoinflammatory diseases. And I found it very interesting because we talk about cytokine storm with COVID, and then we talk about group of conditions that is prone to complication called MAS, which is a type of cytokine storm. And I was positively surprised to find out that patients with autoinflammatory conditions did actually quite well in terms of COVID-19 outcomes. So in this group, patients who had underlying condition had the flare of the disease in about 31% of the cases, most of them during the COVID episode, some of them right after, but majority of them did really well. Most of the patients had mild to moderate illness. About 60% of them had lingering symptoms like myalgia, arthralgia, respiratory issues, but not severe. And in this particular study, they only report one case of neuropsychiatric that required ICU admission, one case of pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome, and one adult. So the rest of the patients performed quite well, and I think it's really reassuring for this group of the conditions.
So before they got COVID, were those patients well controlled and taking medicines that might be beneficial in COVID?
So they don't specify in what stage or what severity of the disease patients were before they contracted COVID, and I think it would be interesting to know that. I would assume and suspect that we're probably well controlled, because I wouldn't expect a patient with active flare of inflammatory disease to do well with COVID-19 outbreak. So yeah, I did not find the information in this particular presentation. It would be interesting to know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's go to, before we get to the plenary session, there was a really interesting drug safety session with the FDA. And Mike Weissman hosted that. We had presentations from 3 FDA officers that talked about a lot of different things. Does any of that highlight your day? Anyone have a comment on that session?
Yeah, I thought I was very interested in the use of a collagenase in Dupuytren's. We often see a lot of this. They have surgery, but it tends to recur. This could be something that we, in the future could be quite a useful way of treating Dupuytren's contractures.
Yeah, the point being that the FDA is looking at the safety, re-examining the safety of XIAFLEX based, but they didn't go into any detail about that. Do you know any more about what the particular concern is?
No, not other than what was presented at the meeting, at the session. Yeah.
They dropped that in at the end, sort of like as a last minute mention, amongst the new indications and new things that they're looking at. Who else enjoyed that session? I mean, I thought that of course the big issue was the discussion of 1133 and what they could say about 1133. And the bottom line is they couldn't say very much about 1133 other than what's already been being presented here at the meeting and what they've already put out. And what everybody's really concerned about is, and there were questions at the end, and the FDA said when asked about why do these worries on tofacitinib 1133 apply to baricitinib and upadacitinib, the answer was that they're all used for the same chronic inflammatory indications. They all seem to have the same risk for those conditions, like whether it be cancer or VTE or cardiovascular events or stroke, and hence a drug, any one of the drugs has the potential to do that. And baricitinib has a pre-existing ongoing safety registry that's now in play. It wasn't done the same way as this particular oral surveillance study was. And there is no post-marketing study in play right now for upadacitinib. What they are doing is that they're waiting for after they got the letter that they have to revise their warnings, and it's going to be a box warning. There's this 30-day, 30-day, 15-day, 5-day. It looks like it could be as much as 75, maybe even 80 days from the September 1 date before a new box warning is going to show up on the package insert or on the website for the drugs. If you look at the website for drugs, there is currently no updated information except for tofacitinib. Their box warning hasn't changed, but they have a little blurb about the safety and that they're basically it needs to be discussed between the patient and the doctor. So that FDA session is usually fairly well attended, and I think had a lot of interest today. Lastly, I think not lastly, but the most importantly, we should get into the plenary session. Anybody want to start with a plenary session they thought was particularly impactful?
I thought that the last plenary session, the final presentation on Alpine 303, which is currently just doing animal trials, but at the very end, they told us that they're about to start a phase 1 study with healthy volunteers to start doing some human studies. But this was a new drug, new mechanism, looking at a dual BAFF and APRIL antagonist for SLE. So they presented a whole bunch of exciting information that it has a good immunomodulatory activity and efficacy in animal models. It's been shown to decrease plasma cells and immunoglobulin secretions, and everything in terms of tolerability in the animals and everything looks encouraging. And it's just exciting with all the new medications that we've had in the lupus pipeline that this is something very, very in the early stages, but I'm interested to see what happens from there.
You do know, of course, that there have been APRIL inhibitors in the past that really have never worked out. Mm-hmm. They sort of crashed and burned. BAFF is belimumab, and it's done okay, but pretty slow uptake. My concern is there is a lot of drug development in the area of lupus. I don't know who to use these drugs in, meaning if you get a new drug like voclosporin or now the new belimumab indication where you have an indication for nephritis, that's great, but give me an indication for lupus. Well, it's hardly not going to be used, and the number of patients, in the United States with lupus is 290,000. I'm sorry. I'm blanking on the number. Yeah, it's about 200,000 or so. And, of course, the Lupus Foundation says it's 5 million, but that's the number of ANA positivity, not lupus. So of that 200,000 or so, what number need a new therapy beyond what you can do with hydroxychloroquine, azathioprine, mycophenolate, intermittent steroids, comorbidity management, et cetera. It's getting to a small number, and it becomes a highly competitive market. And I don't know that we know a lot. Like the great debate was on voclosporin versus belimumab. If anything, it was a very good debate, but is that going to help people make a decision?
Yeah, I think, the other new medicine out there is anifrolumab, which I think we know pretty well that if we have patients with high interferon, it would respond well. But in a clinical practice, outside of a research setting, figuring out who those patients are, if there's a way to start to use some of these markers and measure some of these things, I think there are ways we can target them to the patients. But I think in clinical practice, it's well behind what the.
I've been screaming for years in RA that if you want to keep piling on with drugs, that all have the same ACR20, 50, 70 response, don't expect me to use a new drug because you're not telling me a better way to use it, a smarter way where it's going to work and exactly who. I think this is a lesson for the lupus community where the market is smaller, the disease is more severe, the number of drugs are starting to pile on, and if they don't come into the game with a rule, a biomarker, a profile that really augments the response, we shouldn't be adopting it very quickly. When I started my fellowship, one of my attendings said, "We don't start new drugs here. We let everybody else start them, and then 10 years later, if they're still around, we could use them." And I thought, well, I'm not sure what kind of fellowship this is going to be, but obviously conservatism does prevail. So. Anybody else have a favorite from that session? Olga, you and I are into autoinflammatory diseases. We had this great presentation from the NIH on that genotype, that certain gene mutations, specific gene mutations, the valine leading the way, is a worse subset of the VEXAS syndrome with high mortality rates and whatnot. And the other thing about that analysis of a cohort of patients was that it was the patients who had needed the most amount of transfusions were the ones who were going to do poorest. The transfusions, I guess, reflecting the myelofibrosis and the marrow disease that sometimes affects that disease. I thought it was a fabulous presentation. I just haven't seen many of those cases. Has anybody seen a VEXAS case yet?
Yeah, we have seen one that obviously there's an overlap. I think the plenary covered this in 1426 about the overlap between this and relapsing polychondritis and SWEETS and a few of these other conditions. They're all steroid responsive, but I think the genetic testing is going to help us kind of identify these patients better. So there is so much overlap between the classification criteria with these conditions with VEXAS.
Yeah. Go ahead, Olga.
Yeah, and I think, there's mimicry with the relapsing polychondritis and similarity in presentation may result in a lot of underdiagnosis of VEXAS. So I think, having high level of suspicion for VEXAS and triggering the genetic testing is quite important, especially in condition that has such a high mortality rate. So just having awareness about the disease spread around is very important.
Dr. Ferrata, who did the presentation, did tease the audience by saying that there's companies that are working on the genetic testing, so it'll become available, but that clinically you might suspect VEXAS if the patient has a high MCV and a dropping platelet count. Isn't that kind of cool? Okay. Anything else from the plenary session before we move on? No. I like the Junipero study, which is the secukinumab data. Being given to kids with either enthesitis-related arthritis, the ERA variant, or kids with juvenile psoriatic arthritis. It was a typical JIA design where everybody gets drug going in, open label, and then the responders then randomized to continuation or withdrawal, and they looked at flare rates. And clearly the drug works really, really well for both those conditions, and also for not just enthesitis, but also dactylitis. And, the 102-week outcomes were really quite impressive. Adding to a growing list of drugs that are now available to the pediatric population. When we started getting into RA trials, like around the end of the 2000 or so, and developing, soon thereafter, the FDA came out with a mandate that said that if a drug company is going to develop a drug for RA, they got to make an effort to develop it for, JIA as well. And so we've seen a lot of drugs that have been approved for JIA, from abatacept to, tofacitinib, and now the secukinumab being added to one of these variants, I think makes the pediatric rheumatology community quite happy. So let's go into the afternoon. Anything in the afternoon that you thought was something that was a takeaway, Olga?
I cannot think of any afternoon sessions, actually. I think more of my interesting presentations were in the morning.
Yeah. How about Knowledge Bowl? Anybody see Knowledge Bowl?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Was there a winner?
Yeah. Well, UTMB won actually, where that's where I'm right now.
UTMB?
Yeah.
All right. So let's be clear. I mean, first off, you wouldn't be lying to us. A person who's from UTMB in Galveston, Texas. Akhil Sood is actually a third-year resident going into rheumatology. Third year, correct, Akhil?
Yes.
And he's just joined the RheumNow faculty, so we're glad to have you. But they won the Knowledge Bowl?
They did win.
Fabulous.
Yeah, they got the final Jeopardy right.
Do you remember what the final Jeopardy question was?
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly, but it was about a specific mutation with and yeah, I don't remember the exact, but it was an autoinflammatory actually related.
Well, could it have been the criteria? I saw one of the questions was the Yamaguchi criteria refers to what? And they said you could have used Cush or Fautrell.
I saw that.
and of course they're talking about Still's disease, which I thought was funny. So, all right, congratulations UTMB, go Galveston. All right, I don't usually get to attend that, but I keep hearing these great stories about the Knowledge Bowl. It's a lot of fun, and I think that it really gets serious when it comes to the competition. So, anybody else have a great afternoon session we want to end with?
I thought the afternoon session on from the RA abstracts that Antoni had mentioned, the one session on the one presentation on methotrexate and its toxicity, but there was a session on long-term effectiveness of what they call ultra low dose rituximab, where they give just 200 milligrams for rituximab, which seemed to have very good outcomes, but very interesting there. And there was I think everything in that session was worth checking out.
And with that ultra low dose, did they show data on how long the B cell depletion was sustained?
So they didn't. I actually chatted with the author, and we have a podcast that came out with RheumNow already, and he said they didn't show any CD19 levels as part of the presentation, but he said that it did bring down the CD19 down to 0. It took less time for it to regenerate compared to other patients, but they were still able to do every 6 month scheduled dosing without any problems.
Rituximab, how low can you go? I find this to be useful in patients who have limited financial resources, and if we can get a vial or two, that can last them pretty good. Great. I like mentioning that one. We've also been looking at it with a group that I'm working with. Antoni, do you have anything in the afternoon that you liked?
Yeah, I thought there was also a contrasting study one on steroids. If you use it for 30 days, you can sort of increase the risk in the next 30 days. But then there was also a contrasting study on statins again, coming back again that using statins reduce your cardiovascular risk and all-cause mortality. So somewhat a kind of nice balance between the two therapies that we could possibly use in RA.
Yeah. Of course, the statin data came out earlier this year, just before the meeting, about the statins not preventing the onset of RA. That did not pan out as people had hoped. And you're mentioning the number of days. I want to, Mike Weissman in the FDA safety session asked the question of the FDA. Here's baricitinib, as a potential therapy for patients with COVID-19, but yet baricitinib is now being listed as a safety concern. And the FDA's response to that was baricitinib's use for COVID-19 is limited to 4 milligrams a day for 1 week or up to 14 days max, during which you wouldn't expect much of a cardiovascular or cancer risk. So I think that's important that everyone should know that.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, TYK2, we've also seen quite a lot at the ACR. Those should also probably be sort of reviewed in terms of the safety.
And that question was asked, and they avoided it, but they said it's clearly in the family, and hence it'll be reviewed for the same risks. But since they're not FDA approved, they're not going to get that label. But that data is going to be very important going forward. Closing comments. Anyone want to close with something they're looking forward to or something they were excited about? Akhil?
Yeah, I mean, today I think was a really great day. I think a lot of great talks. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, with like a lot of the talks for me were really centered around aging, from the lecture on multi-complexity in RA, and then the posters. And even the afternoon, there was a talk on the immunology of aging as well, which I thought was really interesting, showing that how changes in T cell function, lymphocytes, and can actually affect susceptibility to infection, and even accelerated within rheumatic disease as well.
Yeah, there's this whole very cool area going on targeting cellular senescence in the future, and where that's going to go, that's going to be kind of neat. Olga?
Well, what I like, I'm not sure if it was morning and afternoon today, but there is a lot of talk about comorbidities in axial spondyloarthropathies. There's a particularly poster on like undiagnosed depression in AxSpa, and look, there are quite high levels of undiagnosed depression. They go in parallel with like the BASDAI scores being bad, and then again, more prevalence of depression in female versus male patients. So I think more emphasis on comorbidities in AxSpa is what I'm looking forward to learn more about.
The comorbidity story keeps happening all over the place, where if there's comorbidities in play, multimorbidity in play, worse responses, worse outcomes. Yeah. And we're just rheumatologists, meaning that we think all that stuff's going to happen magically in the hands of the primary care. That's a big concern going forward. Eric?
Yeah, so I think what I'm looking for, obviously tomorrow, we have all the late-breaking abstracts and a lot of COVID information. And then also the oral surveillance data when that gets presented on the JAK inhibitors has been kind of the elephant in the room the whole conference thus far. So that'll be exciting.
Yeah. And Antoni, any final recommendations or what you're looking forward to?
Tomorrow I'm going to learn a lot of new therapies in PSA and XPA. There's a whole session tomorrow. So really looking forward to the new therapies.
I'm looking, boy, we got a lot of comments. I'm sorry, I didn't pay any attention. So let me see if I can do this quickly. Recall EMRs like that, EMR. Biotin for alopecia, sounds like bogus to me. To switch methotrexate to parenteral. If you switch methotrexate to parenteral, you make toxicity worse. You're delivering more drug. That's an ACR recommendation. That's totally idiotic. If you do split dose oral, or you switch to parenteral sub-Q, you increase toxicity. You do not decrease any toxicity. I mean, the data on that is abundantly clear. Methotrexate for nausea, like a tendon rupture, I think it was tendon rupture and skin necrosis with Xiaflex. Thank you for that input. And David asked, what's the chances you think that they will ask upadacitinib for a safety phase 3B or 4 safety study? I don't know. I haven't heard that. And I think if anything is going to happen, the FDA is not likely to ask for it. The company may say, we want to do it because we don't want to be saddled with this because we think our drug is safer. We'll see if they actually want to spend what amounts to about $10 million to do a study like that, maybe much more than that. UPA has its own safety data. That's long-term safety data, Leica, that is from Gerd Burmester. It basically shows what everybody knows. Go Texas, go Galveston. All right, we're getting down to the bottom. What's the likelihood that a community rheumatologist will see a VEXAS syndrome? You know what? A tornado can happen anytime. And it's better to know about it and think about it, especially. So the bottom line is, I think Olga says, is that you see a relapsing polychondritis patient, maybe you need to rethink that. All right, folks, thanks so much for spreading the wisdom. I want to remind our audience that tomorrow we are going to do rheumatology roundup, Dr. Artie Cavanaugh and myself. Ain't no telling what he's going to say and how I'm going to respond. So be sure to tune in. It's going to be a 1-hour session and we will take questions. Good night, everyone.
Night.